Hello and welcome to the Symposium. My name is Carl, and today we're going to be talking about freedom, particularly freedom of the will versus determinism. Do we have free will, or are our actions predetermined? And to begin looking at this very complex subject, so strap in, we're going to be looking at Arthur Schopenhauer's prized essay on the freedom of the will, or at least parts of it. He was a 19th century German philosopher, and he wrote Freedom of the Will as a self-contained argument in attempts to demonstrate what we call free will is not really as free as we might think, although he does manage to prevent the case from free will being totally abandoned, and instead manages to carve out what he calls relative free will. His argument is generally considered to be deterministic in nature, though. The essay is the answer to a question, and the question is, can the freedom of the human will be demonstrated from self-consciousness? Schopenhauer begins with his definitions, initially to discover what freedom actually means. He splits it into three distinct variants. 1. Physical freedom, 2. Intellectual freedom, and 3. Moral freedom. To Schopenhauer, physical freedom is a negative concept that is the absence of material obstruction, which allows an animal to proceed with whatever movements of which they are capable, spurred on by the impulse of their own will. Physical freedom is taken to be ability to take action without impediment, and political freedom is classed as a form of physical freedom. Intellectual freedom is when the mind has a clear understanding of the motives of action, either abstract or concrete, and moral freedom is the free choice of the will, choice made without compulsion or necessity, which is the kind of freedom that Schopenhauer believes the original question is meant to address. He observes that while a man might be physically free and unimpeded in his ability to follow the course of his own will, his actions might have restricted motives, such as threats, promises, dangers, moral objections, stuff like this. A human's ability to foresee the consequences of their own actions in the abstract, beyond their immediate results, for example, being arrested and going to jail for committing a murder, would otherwise prevent a man from acting where an unreasoning animal might have acted. Schopenhauer calls these non-physical obstacles, and observes that a motive might move a man's will in one direction, but a counter-motive might be stronger and move it in the opposite direction altogether. This leaves Schopenhauer with the question, is the will itself free? If we consider the statement, I am free, I can do what I will, Schopenhauer asks what the freedom to will actually means and who is doing it. He expresses this as, can you also will what you will? And observes that this would presumably require some kind of will that lays behind the will itself, leading to an infinite regression. Behind every will is another will, presumably. It's wills all the way down. Schopenhauer believed it was necessary to redefine freedom from meaning freedom from obstruction to the absence of necessity in general, all necessity in general, in order to create the abstract concept of the will to connect with the physical concept of freedom in order for us to be able to apply the will to the concept of freedom. Schopenhauer believed that it was necessary to redefine freedom from meaning freedom from obstruction to the absence of all necessity in general, in order to enable the abstract concept of the will to connect with the physical concept of freedom. This redefinition leaves freedom as a negative concept, and requires Schopenhauer to define necessary, which he does as, necessary is that which follows from a given sufficient ground. This covers logical, mathematical, and physical necessity, and is capable of inversion. Free is that in which all relationships are contingent and not necessary. And as you can see from that kind of absolutist statement, human beings are not free from all relationships. Some relationships are in fact necessary, or at least appear to be. When Schopenhauer applies this to the will of a human, he derives from this that for our will to be free, the manifestations of the will must not be the consequent of given grounds. The inverse of this is that a free will would be determined by nothing at all, and all manifestations would come originally from itself and have no outside cause. This means that acts of will manifested as actions that are necessary are not free, such as eating or fleeing from danger, whereas actions that did not have to be taken are free, such as choosing what to eat, as they would be contingent. Although we could always argue that a contingent action that follows from a necessary one really is only a very small amount of freedom. Schopenhauer then moves on to the will before self-consciousness, in which he addresses the problem of the presupposition of the will when determining one's own actions. I can do what I will presupposes the independence of the will. It focuses on the consequences of the will when the question is on the grounds of the will. If one is presented with two opposite and mutually exclusive wishes, and suggests that the choice is based on absolutely nothing but their own will, on what does that decision hinge? Schopenhauer returns to his will behind the will, the eye of one's eye, as in, I will that I will it. After drilling down through a series of defences, Schopenhauer finds that the question is, what are the origins of our acts of will themselves? And he finds that the immediate self-consciousness contains no information about this. And so Schopenhauer has answered the question, can the freedom of the human will be demonstrated from self-consciousness, by saying no, there doesn't appear to be anything in the self-consciousness of a human that demonstrates the freedom of their will. That appears to come from something else. The next section is the will before the consciousness of other things, and Schopenhauer takes our law of causality, that consequences follow from grounds, as a universal a priori assumption, and turns his eye to identifying what human consciousness is by setting out the natural hierarchy of inorganic objects, plants, animals, and humans, and distinguishing between cause, stimulus, and motivation. Cause is the Newtonian effect on physics, on objects, whether they are organic or not, and every action has a direct and opposite reaction to a measurable degree. Stimulus is a cause in which there is no uniformity between action and reaction, and it is not in and of itself measurable. So stimuli can affect plants, animals, and humans. Motivation is a cause that requires cognition, and so is only exhibited by animals and humans. All motion undertaken deliberately by animals and humans is done by intent, and so requires a motivation in order to achieve. This is the inner force that we describe as the will, according to Schopenhauer. Reason is the mechanism that humans alone use to examine abstractions of the world in order to consider our situation and expand our range of choices beyond those immediate ones that would be otherwise available to animals. Schopenhauer believed that, relative to animals, humans do have relative freedom of will, but it is not disconnected from causality and necessity. He gives the example of a man making choices to go to a theatre, a walk, or whatever it is, whatever leisure activity he wishes to do, with a sentient pool of water that might say, I can form waves, rivers, or stay still, as if the water has any real choice in the matter. In the same way that a body of water reacts to outside forces, a man's motives are shaped by the incentives around him and the desires from within him. So, effectively, he is saying that while it might appear that we have some kind of free will, we are directly controlled by our circumstances to a large degree and the innate necessities of being a human being. So while you might be able to choose what kind of food that you like, you are going to have to eat something. And so if this is freedom, it's a very narrow range of what we can call free will. And this is why he calls it relative free will. Schopenhauer's redefinition of the meaning of physical freedom, which is absence from impediment, ends with the revised definition being the absence of necessity. He requires an expanded definition of freedom because the term has several different meanings in several different contexts, as he lists, and it is not enough to simply say freedom is the absence of obstacles, because this does not connect with the will itself. If there are no obstacles, then by definition the will must be free, even if a more thorough examination of the subject, which he provides, demonstrates that it is not that simple, and the will is not an agent that is independent of the flesh and the pressures exerted on it by the outside world. This change is necessary for Schopenhauer because he wishes to make a transition from the freedom to do to freedom to will, which renders the first definition unfit as it resolves the will as the source of itself, with Schopenhauer's behind the will infinite regression pointing out that this can never be resolved. Following on from his earlier analysis that categorized free things as absent from necessity, this makes unfree things those things that must follow from sufficient grounds. Schopenhauer makes the rather absolutist point that a free will would have to mean a will that was determined by nothing at all. Any manifestations of the will would have to follow from the will itself exclusively, unaffected by any necessary external conditions. For example, fleeing from a forest fire must no longer be the result of being in physical danger and the will doing what it can to move one's body out of danger. The will must have some other separate reason to flee from this forest fire. I think it would be quite easy to say that Schopenhauer has made things too easy for himself by making the distinction between free and unfree based on such hard lines such as necessity and contingency. While not incorrect, it seems that there may be a reasonable middle ground that does not exist in these extreme positions, without failing to adequately cover the relevant points that Schopenhauer raises. There may be more moderate definitions of free that are more applicable in a real-world sense. Schopenhauer believed that the will came before self-consciousness, that the feeling residing in self-consciousness was that I can do what I will. That's the essence of what self-consciousness is. This presupposes the freedom of the will and gives no information about where the will derives its own purpose from, which Schopenhauer points out would be an infinite regress, the eye of one's eye. He asserts that there seems to be no information about the will in the self-consciousness when the question is, in his opinion, correctly understood. So his argument can be simplified as the cause, which is the ground of the will, follows, causes or leads to my act of will, whatever my action is, which is the decision of my will to take an action, which then translates to my bodily action, which is the consequence of my will, which is my body actually moving. An example of this would be my lack of satisfaction with the way my body looks as the cause of an act of will that takes an action to lose weight, which is manifested as my bodily action of using a treadmill for 30 minutes every day, which I obviously did when I was writing this script and don't do now, but I am still dieting. Schopenhauer compares a man's option for action, such as going to a walk, going to a club, going to climb a tower, go to the theatre, or walk off into the distance and never come back, to the varying states of water, sort of the rushing torrent, the calm pool, the high waves, as if the water has chosen to take these forms and is not being acted upon by outside forces. He compares a man to choosing certain options with his own life to that of the water in different stages. But until the causes enter, he says, it is impossible for him to do anything and then he must do it, with the same apparently being true for water. I actually don't agree there's an apt comparison. Water not being a conscious being, where a man is. A man naturally does have outside pressures on him because he's a real thing that exists in the world, which in many circumstances do compel his behaviour, but he is not an unreasoning, unthinking, inanimate object. He is alive. All action is filtered through his consciousness, and he does have the ability to decide to act against his immediate interests, which is something that Schopenhauer does note in his essay, and he can take action that would be strange or unfounded on a whim, whereas water doesn't actually possess this ability. Even if this wasn't necessarily a free choice, this was inspired by something else. The decision still lies within that narrow band of freedom that Schopenhauer agrees upon with his argument. And I think, just as a quick break from my own notes here, this is what we derive the concept of heroism from, where it would be completely natural to flee from a danger. The hero doesn't and actually tries to tackle it in a physical way, or in any other way, to be honest. But the hero steps up to tackle the danger even at personal risk. This is what we consider to be heroism to be. And heroism seems, by Schopenhauer, what he's laid out here so far, it seems that it's only possible because we have this kind of free will that means we can act against our immediate interests and look further on and see that there are actually other risks that are worth taking. But anyway, I think he's oversimplified the cognitive ability of man, and in my opinion, has reduced him to a vessel through which forces flow, removing any agency he may have possessed as an individual and reducing him merely to the sum of his parts. The question for Schopenhauer is, if something is the cause of our actions, does that render our actions unfree? And I don't believe his answer is satisfactory. This argument was addressed by P.F. Strawson in a work he wrote called Freedom and Resentment. It wasn't necessarily a direct response to Schopenhauer, although it might have been, I'm just not aware if it was. But he is talking about the very concept of determinism, which is one half of what Schopenhauer is laying out. Are we free or are we deterministic beings? And so Strawson begins by dividing the world into two categories: those that understand the thesis of determinism and those that do not. For himself, he thinks that he doesn't understand the thesis of determinism because he feels that it's never adequately explained. But he does lay out 4 positions on determinism from those who claim to know what the thesis of determinism is. The first one is, if determinism is true, moral obligation and responsibility are illusory, and punishment and blame are therefore unjustified. He calls these people the pessimists, the people who believe that we are predetermined and that we have no responsibility for what we do. The second position is that if determinism is true, we must still hold others morally accountable, because it seems that it is a necessary thing, and if we don't hold people morally accountable, it appears that there is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy and their behaviour just gets worse, which does imply that they're actually not actually as determined as one might think, and maybe structure and order have their right place in the human world. But these people he calls the optimists. So we've got the pessimists who think that humans don't have agency, and the optimists who think that determinism is still true, but they do still need to be held to account. And then you've got position 3, which is, for moral accountability to be justified, determinism must be true. I've got to say I don't really understand that position. Moral skepticism. Position 4, moral skepticism regarding notions of guilt, blame and responsibility are inherently confused regardless of the validity of determinism. But positions 3 and 4 are actually not very important for this particular essay. The point of Strawson's essay is to reconcile the positions of the optimist and the pessimist. He's ignoring those who have genuine moral skepticism and who do not understand, those who do not understand the thesis of determinism. So he's speaking from specifically within the framework of deterministic theory, whatever that is, between 2 particular positions that have been carved out, and he thinks these are reconcilable if you look at them in the right way. The pessimist believes that determinism is true without doubt and moral judgments must be therefore invalid, and the optimist believes that determinism either is not true or if it is, our moral judgments are still valid. Strawson sets up the optimist position, which observes that the results of actions like punishment and disapproval as effective measures to curb bad behaviour. But this does not disprove determinism itself. The pessimist then responds that just punishment and condemnation imply moral responsibility, which implies freedom, which disproves determinism, but this is not so because Strawson himself is defining freedom as the absence of certain conditions that would make punishment or condemnation inappropriate. This is given to mean compulsion by force, insanity, or any other means outside of an individual's control. The pessimist then concedes, in Strawson's hypothetical telling of the argument, that freedom is thus defined can coexist with determinism, but the pessimist finds that there's something missing. Strawson believes that this is the genuinely free identification of the will with an act that is the thing that is incompatible with determinism. If we will it, it was not determined, which is incompatible with the determinist thesis. The pessimist will concede that freedom as an absence of conditions which make punishment inappropriate can coexist with determinism, but will shift the question to ask how this justifies blame. The only reason given for punishment is its efficacy, which changes the question from being moral to being practical, which is the wrong basis on which to ask. Strawson believes that the optimist is out of arguments at this point, and if you haven't been able to follow this, because there's every chance that I have not explained this as fully as is necessary, because Strawson's thinking is remarkably complex here. Strawson, however, wishes to provide the optimist with at least one more argument, which is the purpose of the essay. He declares that he would like to discuss something he describes as the non-detached attitudes and reactions of those directly involved, shifting the discussion to a neighbouring field of the importance of attached to the attitudes and intentions of others and how they affect our feelings and reactions. He thinks that this will give us greater clarity as to whether we should treat someone as a moral actor with agency and will that can have independent, what we might call free intent behind it, and the actions and the consequence of the actions that they have taken. So a person's intentions manifested through their actions affect our feelings regarding them. To ask forgiveness is to recognize that our own actions can cause resentment, and to forgive someone is to forswear our resentment, to let it go. Strawson asks us to consider the variable range and intensity of our different kinds of relationships, and the importance of the kinds of reactive attitudes to which we are prone, and the range and intensity of these in regards to the goodwill, or that lack thereof, of others. He observes that there are two kinds of resentment-alleviating situations: unintended and compelled. This is on the part of the person who has taken the action, as in either they didn't mean to do it, as in they might have stepped on you by accident and they apologise, or they couldn't help it. For example, if it's someone with some kind of mental disorder and they act in a way that they can't have any agency over controlling, you don't blame them for that. Strawson makes the distinction that while we are justified in our reactions as we view the perpetrator as a moral agent, we view the injury done as one for which he was not fully responsible, and life demands this to be a part of our social normality. So this essentially puts the two considerations into two subgroups. Either the act was a temporary lapse in judgment or loss of control, as in they tripped over and knocked into you, whatever it was, or the person is not a moral agent at all. Either they're a child, or they're insane, or something like that. There's something that hinders their cognition. It is the second subgroup that Strawson finds important, as we remove the person from the category of a moral agent, and therefore we don't hold them morally responsible for their actions. It is here that Strawson introduces the concept of the objective attitude, in opposition to what he calls the reactive attitude. It is here that Strawson introduces the concept of the objective attitude, in opposition to the reactive attitude. The reactive attitude is one of the individual who has been personally slighted, who has had a lack of goodwill from one party, and is resentful of that and expects some kind of restitution, usually in the form of an apology. A person who is dealing with someone who has no control over their actions is therefore forced to adopt a position, as Strawson describes, as a manager, as someone who is not personally involved in a relationship with the person who has wronged them, and instead sees them as an object of social policy, as in we treat other people as moral agents and expect consideration from them, and if someone isn't capable of that, we detach our personal feelings from what they do because we don't ascribe to them ill will, because we don't think their will is responsible for what they're doing. This attitude is divorced from interpersonal feelings such as resentment, gratitude, forgiveness, anger, or personal love. Strawson believes that when dealing with those we do not consider moral agents, we naturally adopt an objective managerial attitude towards the subject. He asks, what effect would or should the acceptance of determinism have on our reactive attitudes towards others? If our reactive, this is the personal attitudes, are essentially our response to goodwill or a lack thereof, because obviously these things go the other way. When someone does something nice for us, we thank them. We don't expect an apology, we reciprocate in kind. Would the acceptance of determinism as true not destroy all reactive attitudes by rendering all people outside of what we would define as a moral agent? As in, if we are saying people do not have free will, why do we act like we think they have free will? Why do we expect them to be able to make a moral judgment on their own behaviour and take the appropriate action to show that they have goodwill towards us, if they are all simply predetermined animals? Strawson is arguing that if determinism is true, then the reactive attitude makes no sense, as we would all be, in a sense, moral idiots, and unable to be held responsible for our actions. If we cannot be held responsible for our actions, then it makes no sense for us to respond to each other's trespasses with a reactive personal attitude, and we would be forced to approach our relationships with objective attitudes, which essentially destroys the foundation of what a relationship is, which is a mutual exchange of goodwill. Strawson is forced to reframe the question to be, if determinism were true, what is rational to do in such a situation? In his opinion, the answer would be only that which is beneficial to human life. He concludes that we cannot operate in the real world with such a belief, as he thinks that human nature would not permit it, and honestly I'm inclined to agree. He expands his view of reactive attitudes to include things that he calls vicarious moral attitudes, that is, interpersonal reactions to behaviour or attitudes on the behalf of others. For example, one who experiences vicarious resentment could be termed to be morally indignant or disapproving. It wasn't necessarily them that something happened to, but they saw the thing and it still offended their moral senses. It is the impersonal character of the attitude, as it is vicarious, that requires the qualifier of moral, as it is a moral judgment that is being made about someone on behalf of someone else. Vicarious attitudes rest on the same moral foundations as reactive attitudes. They are based on an expectation of goodwill and react to a demonstration of ill will, but not to oneself, but in a generalized form on behalf of those whose presumably moral indignation can be felt. Strawson believes that these are connected with another set of attitudes that emanate from the person who has committed the perceived wrong. The demands placed on that person and their response to them is what Strawson calls self-reactive attitudes, which are associated with demands on oneself for others, otherwise known as obligations. In the case of one who has wronged another, the obligation is to feel guilt or shame and be remorseful about what one has done. Strawson describes these three kinds of attitudes as being, quote, humanly connected, and based on a demand for interpersonal regard from their wider moral community. Strawson asks, can we have objective moral reactive attitudes? As in, can we objectively view a situation between two people through a moral lens in this way? And it's all getting quite complicated now, isn't it? He also asks what the relevance of determinism is to the vicarious analogues. His parallel answers are as follows. The first one is, when we suspend our reactive attitudes, it is never a consequence of our belief in determinism in the sense that all behaviour might be determined. And so to abandon objective attitudes would lead to egocentricity, as in everything would be a personal slight, regardless of how unintended or uncontrolled that it was. And it raises the question of whether this question is even rational. If we are determined, then how can we adopt any kind of objective attitudes at all? If everyone's behaviour was determined, we would probably end up not regarding things like resentment and gratitude as things that even exist. The idea of feeling personally affronted by another person's behaviour simply wouldn't make sense, as there would be no assumption that they gave other people moral consideration and not you, which is the source of the affront. Everyone else would just be assumed to be pre-programmed. If anything, the deterministic thesis, whatever it is, appears to lead to the abolition of morality itself, because our moral attitudes are based on our ability to have personal reactive attitudes, in Strawson's opinion, and if determinism is true, then there is no justification for personal reactive attitudes. And Strawson believes that this would lead to an inevitable joint decay that would occur between personal and vicarious moral reactive attitudes, and just degenerate into egocentricity. So to conclude, despite the absolutely excellent construction of Schopenhauer's argument, I think that Strawson has actually reframed the question in order to, and reframed the circumstance enough to be able to demonstrate that we actually do believe, whether we can logically conclude it from Schopenhauer's construct or not, that there is such a thing as a free will. He clearly explains that if the thesis of determinism is true, then it makes no sense to hold reactive attitudes because we do not consider each individual to be a moral agent. If their actions are predetermined, then we must take an objective attitude. Strawson asks the question of whether it is rational to respond with personal reactive attitudes, but concludes that it is probably a core part of human nature that we cannot change. This means that the thesis of determinism is probably irrelevant. It is probably beyond our power to socially act as if it were true anyway, which sounds quite deterministic, doesn't it?